Welcome back to Teacher Talks. I'm Maria Keffler.
And I'm Erin Brewer, and today we're going to talk about the concept of a transgender child. Is there such a thing, Maria?
I don't believe there is any such thing as a transgender child, and I think we're going to talk about several reasons why we believe that. But I would say primarily, I do not believe in the concept of transgender children because there is no evidence for it. There's no test you can do. There's no chromosomal markers. There's no physical markers. There's nothing except the child say so. And we know that kids don't know who they are, despite what the gender industry would like to say. Kids are very susceptible to what they're told, to what they're taught. And I really find this to be an ideology that's been put on kids rather than an organic something that kids are.
Right. And I think one of the things that's so frustrating about this is that there's this acceptance that there are kids who are truly transgender. And anytime a child who has had a transgender identity desists or detransitions, the other side always says, well, that's because they weren't really trans. That's how they accept it. And yet they say that any child who's trans, any child that is insistent, consistent, and persistent in their identity of being transgender is transgender. And one of the reasons I started to realize this was a huge flaw in the ideology is that when I started speaking about my childhood gender dysphoria and talking about the trans identity I had, the activists would say, well, you were never really trans. I'm like, well, I was insistent, consistent, and persistent, which is what the definition is. So how is it that you can say that I wasn't really trans, but another child is, unless they desist or detransition, and then they never really were trans? It really is sort of internally incoherent ideology, but especially for children who are, we know that children are very influenced by their surroundings, by their environment, by the information that they hear. The idea that just changing their external expression somehow changes their core identity, and that this identity, gender identity, is the only thing that's like that, because we have religious identity, political identity, cultural identity. We have all these other identities that aren't somehow able to be born in the wrong body, but for some reason this gender identity is. And so, like you said, there's no test for this. There's no diagnosis. In fact, the only way that gender dysphoria is diagnosed is a child saying that they are. So the doctors accept the child's self-diagnosis. Well, that's pretty scary when we start just saying this child is transgender because they say they're transgender.
And your diagnosis, your gender dysphoria, you said it was persistent, insistent, and consistent. That was for years, right? You went through this for multiple years.
Right. And yet it's dismissed because I desisted. I didn't continue to identify as transgender. I've also had people tell me that I have internalized transphobia and that I'll never truly be happy until I embrace my internal male self. Again, this is all very sort of mystical, spiritual, and it's not consistent. And it's very frustrating to me that we have people who have accepted the concept that a child can be trans, that there are children who are born transgender. I think that you made an argument about that relating to, what does it mean about God if we have a child who's transgender? And do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's something that the gender industry will hear some of their ideologues say, especially when they're talking with children. They'll say, God made a mistake. And I started really thinking about that. What does that mean? If you believe that there is true trans, if you believe children can be trans, you can only believe one of three things about God. One, God is cruel. Because to create somebody who has a disconnect between their physical body and their internal self, that is putting them in a state of disequilibrium, in a state of discomfort. That is, by the gender industry's standard, that is saying this child must be medicalized in order to be brought into congruity with his intergendered self. That's cruel. That is a cruel thing for a God to do. Or you believe that God is incompetent. God couldn't help this happening, that this is just natural variation. And most faith traditions do not believe in incompetent deities. They believe that if God created, God is able to create and sustain imperfection. And so I think we would look at this and say the fact that some people experience gender dysphoria is not unlike some people experiencing a physical illness, a physical problem. Not going too deep into theology, man has introduced sin into the world and it infects everything. And so cancer is not God's idea. It is something that has come into the world out of sin and out of human pain, human error. The third thing that you have to believe about God, if you don't believe that he's cruel or incompetent, is that he simply doesn't exist. And that's really the only intellectually honest position one can take if one believes in true trans.
I guess maybe the other would be that there is a God of our genders who can somehow control whether or not a child is born into the correct gender or not the correct gender. It's very confusing. And I think that kind of boiling it down to its core, what does this mean about our belief systems? If we believe that a child can be born into the wrong body, what does that mean about everything else? And why is it this one specific thing? That we, as you said, we have illness, we have mental health disturbances, we have all kinds of things that we're grappling with, but we never sort of accept, well, a heroin addict was born into the wrong body. They were born into a body that needs heroin, therefore we're going to give it to them. Or the anorexic was born into the wrong body. She was born into a thin body, but she feels fat, therefore we have to treat her as if we're fat. There's just, it doesn't make sense. There's no internal structure in this ideology that's coherent. And so I think pushing back and saying, there are definitely kids with gender dysphoria, no doubt. There are children who have assumed a transgender identity as a result of a social contagion. There are kids who have assumed a transgender identity as a result of not being accepted because maybe they are not conforming to regressive gender stereotypes. Those are all true statements, but they don't suggest that there is such a thing as a true transgender person, a true transgender child. And that's what we're really getting at, is trying to parse that apart. So when a child comes and says they're transgender, to push back and say, no, you're not transgender, you're having some difficult feelings. Or no, you're not transgender, but you're identifying as if you are the opposite sex. Let's look at that and figure out why you're doing that.
As professionals, we want to try to help children toward truth. We want to have children grow into healthy, functional adults who can lead happy and productive lives. And so I liked what you said. We need to examine, if I believe in true trans, what does that say to all of the other things I believe? And you touched on, babies. We don't say babies who were born with heroin addictions need to have more heroin. There are such babies. There are babies who are born to mothers who are drug addicts. And we recognize that is not a healthy state of being. We need to heal that child, not continue to harm the child.
And that ultimately is why it's important not to accept the idea of a trans child, because ultimately that's a harmful acceptance. That's a pathway that's going to constantly be telling the child that who they were born isn't okay. They have to basically kill that person and become a new person. That's not something that's going to be healthy